Hey there, sci-fi enthusiasts. Ready to dive deep into a world where cybernetics meets psychological horror? When the world was focused on innovative arcade first-person shooters like Doom and Hexen, Quake, Heretic, Duke Nukem, you know the group of them. There was another group of video game designers laying the groundwork for all of the immersive worlds that are so commonplace today in another style of first person shooting. This group blended immersive storytelling with innovative gameplay, and in doing so, they created a haunting masterpiece that still sends shivers down our spines. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the System Shock series, but there's more to this story than just the pair of games. Today, we're going to be exploring the rise and fall of Looking Glass Studios, the brilliant minds behind the iconic series. We're going to look at their co-developers for System Shock 2 Irrational Games, and then we'll explore how the legacy of the System Shock series continues to influence gaming even today. So jack into your neural interface and brace yourself for a deep dive into the terrifying corridors of System Shock as we take today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 207th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we're going to delve into the history of Looking Glass Studios and Irrational Games, companies that were ahead of their time in many ways. And we'll focus on one of their most collective, influential creations, System Shock 2, released in August of 1999. This game not only terrified players, but it also laid the groundwork for so many modern immersive sims. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who once tried to hack a vending machine but ended up with a soda bath instead. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, tell us about your damp misadventures with technology.
Well, when you try to get all the sodas out of there, you make sure you do it one at a time.
One at a
Because
time.
otherwise, they all bunch up, and then when the machine starts to move and try to actually vend things, they crush, and then just soda fountain. But not the
Is
kind you
that...
thought.
That's what it turned into, a soda fountain?
Oh, yeah. I think it all stems back to accidentally jumping in a pool with a phone. Technology just never really got over that one.
No, it's been holding it against you the whole time.
Got that right.
That's a shame. Really, that's a big shame. Sorry that happened.
We'll get through it.
Are you
Gotta
sure?
make waterproof technology.
Very true. Very, very true. So, we've got a long story today, a whole lot to talk about, but before I get into it, what else happened during this week in gaming history?
Well, kicking it off on August 11th, 2000, Paper Mario was released for the Nintendo 64 in Japan. Developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo, this unique role-playing game featured a distinctive art style where characters and environments appeared as flat, paper-like figures in a 3D world. Hence the name Paper Mario.
Ooh, well played.
Yeah. Paper Mario follows Mario on a quest to rescue Princess Peach and the Star Spirits from Bowser, who has gained invincibility through the power of the Star Rod. The game combined traditional RPG elements with innovative mechanics, such as time button presses during combat to enhance attacks and defenses. Paper Mario received critical acclaim for its charming visuals, engaging story, and strategic gameplay, establishing it as a beloved title in the Mario franchise and paving the way for numerous sequels.
Have you played any of them?
I have not played them. I have watched a partial playthrough of, I think, The Thousand Door.
Year door.
Thousand Year Door. Thank you. I was missing a word there. Um, Definitely seems like fun. Just never owned them. So never got around to playing them. But if I picked up a copy, I would definitely give them a shot.
They're fantastic games. If you've never played them and you're into role playing games, you really can't go wrong with them. So,
Well, got to pick them up then. Next up, on August 12th, 1988, Nintendo released Famicom Wars for the family computer in Japan. Developed by Intelligent Systems, this turn based strategy game is the first entry in what would become the long running Wars series, which includes titles like Advance Wars. Famicom Wars features two factions, Red Star and Blue Moon, battling for control over various maps. Players take turns commanding units such as infantry, tanks, and artillery to capture cities, defeat enemy forces, and ultimately secure victory. The game was praised for its deep strategic gameplay, accessible mechanics, and replayability. While Famicom Wars was never officially released outside Japan, it laid the groundwork for future installments in the series, which would gain international acclaim and a dedicated fan base.
not my thing. Those tactical games, they're like turn based war games, right?
You're
Not
telling
my
me you
thing.
didn't like Command and Conquer?
No, but these are turn based strategy games. I never got into them. Not real time strategy. We both know I got very much into real time strategy. Mm,
That's fair. Yeah.
yep.
Trying to think of real time or a turn based one, but I can't really think of one that well. So,
XCOM.
oh yeah, that's a good point. I've never seen you play XCOM, so
No, you have not.
all right. Well, following the Famicom train in August 17th, 1987, Air Fortress Air Fortress was released in Japan, developed by HAL Laboratory and published by HAL America. This unique action adventure game combines side scrolling shooting elements with platforming and exploration. Players take on the role of Hale Bailman, not Batman, a lone hero tasked with infiltrating and destroying massive space fortresses that threaten planetary systems. Each level starts with a high speed shoot 'em up segment, where players navigate Hale's spacecraft through enemy defenses. Upon breaching the fortress, the game shifts to a platforming mode, requiring players to navigate interior corridors, disable the fortress's core, and escape before it self destructs. Air Fortress was praised for its engaging gameplay, innovative blend of genres, and atmospheric music, and made it a memorable title on the Famicom and later on the NES in North America. Go figure, I spoke about this one earlier.
You
On
did?
August 17th, 1998, Electronic Arts acquired Westwood Studios, a prominent game development company known for pioneering the real time strategy genre with Command and Conquer series. Founded in 1985 by Brett Sperry and Lewis Castle, Westwood Studios had gained a reputation for creating highly influential games such as Dune 2, Lands of Lore, and the Command and Conquer franchise, which set new standards for RTS games with its innovative gameplay mechanics and compelling narratives. The acquisition by EA aimed to leverage Westwood's expertise and successful franchises to strengthen EA's position in the PA gaming market. However, the move also led to significant changes within Westwood, including the integration of its operation into EA structure, which ultimately contributed to the studio's closure in 2003.
Boo.
Yeah, but despite this, the legacy of Westwood Studios lives on through its groundbreaking contributions to the RTS genre.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Indeed. And with
Well,
that, nothing left for this week in gaming history, so let's kick it off with today's topic.
Paul Narath and Ned Lerner met at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, which is situated about halfway between New York and Boston. Narath was an environmental science major. Lerner was a physics major. Despite what they were studying, they both shared an interest in game development and ended up partnering together on the 1987 space combat simulator Deep Space Operation Copernicus, which was later published by Surtech. Sometime after school, Lerner moved to California to work with Electronic Arts making games, while Neurath went to work for Origin Systems, who had an office in Austin where they were founded and another in New Hampshire. Neurath stayed and worked in their New Hampshire office. Out in California, Ned Lerner founded Lerner Research, which was a development company that specialized in 3D simulation development. With Electronic Arts as their publisher, Lerner Research ended up developing games such as Chuck Yeager's Advanced Flight Trainer, Deep Space, and F-22 Interceptor. Man, I was addicted to combat sims, like flight sims back then, because they were like the cutting edge of computer technology. And all I ever wanted to do was play these games for that reason. So,
Yeah, now that they're tough, you don't want to try anymore.
very true, very true. Now that they're actual simulations, I'm out! The studio also ended up creating the first 3D system that was ever licensed by EA for their game project. So Lerner had, they were happening, right? Neurath, on the other hand, ended up getting his start, like I said, with Origin Systems. He worked on a few adaptations of games that were created by Steve Jackson Games, who we've talked about in previous episodes. Steve Jackson is best known for two things. One, nowadays, is the card game Munchkin. You a Munchkin fan?
I've played it once or twice. I think it's a lot of fun, but you got to have people to play it.
You do, for sure. Also, he is known for the role-playing system GURPS. Now, GURPS was the inspiration for the special system in the Fallout series, so we've talked about GURPS at length before in our Fallout episode, when we were studying Fallout and the history of interplay. Neurath's first game was an adaptation of Steve Jackson's science fiction board war game that was named Ogre. It's a game in which a single giant robot tank called an ogre is pitted against a second player's headquarters that's defended by a mix of tanks, infantry, and artillery. The video game adaptation was released in 1986 and published by Origin. His second game was an adaptation of Steve Jackson's vehicular combat simulation game, which was called Car Wars. It was called Auto Duel. And Auto Duel was a role-playing game that was set in the year 2030, set in the US, where cars are the primary means of protection and defense, and the highways are now dangerous stretches of land ruled by gangs and vigilantes. And they built a role-playing game set in this environment. After Ogre and Auto Duel, he was given design control over a game called Space Rogue, which was a space flight simulation video game. For much of the technical aspects of this game, Neurath actually turned to his old friend, Ned Lerner, whose company, Lerner Research, was specializing in simulation titles. So they're working on Space Rogue, and before the game is completed, Origin Systems decides that they want to consolidate their office space, and so they move everyone back to Texas. Neurath, however, he wasn't interested in moving to Texas, so he stayed in New Hampshire. And with funding help from his friend and the company Lerner Research, he moved in to the now empty Origin office to start his own development studio, which was called Blue Sky Productions. Blue Sky got their start in 1990. They decided that they wanted to make a first-person dungeon crawler similar to a 1987 hit called Dungeon Master. Neurath was able to recruit local talent from MIT. There were other Origin employees who didn't want to move to Texas. And then, of course, he had help from Lerner Research. So collectively, they were able to work on these projects. And together, they developed a basic 3D texture mapped simulation of what a first-person dungeon crawler would look like out of their studio. And they brought that tech demo to the 1990 summer Consumer Electronics Show, CES, where it was noticed by their old bosses who ran Origin Systems, and that would be Richard Garriott and Warren Spector. They were so impressed with the tech demo that they managed to put together that Origin offered to finance Blue Sky's first game as their publisher.
Warren Spector, a name people should recognize.
Warren Spector we've covered before. Very important. Covered it in our and this company, no less, in our Deus Ex episode. Should be the one. And Ultima. Richard Garriott. We did Richard Garriott.
Oh
He,
yeah, I
yeah,
had forgotten, but I definitely recognize Spectre's name.
yeah, Spectre and Deus Ex, Origin, Richard Garriott created Ultima. So we've been here before. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. Now, this project, their first project, they titled Underworld. And when Origin decided to fund the game, they decided that they wanted to rebrand it as a spin-off to the Ultima series before it was released. And so that project became the first in a very well-known series called the Ultima Underground series. Now, the success of Underground led to sequels. There was a continued development of the Ultima Underground series. So Blue Sky Productions got to work on a sequel pretty quickly after the release of Ultima Underworld. Meanwhile, Lerner Research had just finished the 1992 racing video game Car and Driver, and the publisher of Car and Driver, Electronic Arts, had granted them a license to develop the next version of Madden, which would have been Madden 93 for the Sega Genesis. Because of the workload of these individual projects, both companies felt that they needed more help. So Neurath and Lerner began to discuss merging their companies together. When doing so, they decided that a name change was in order, since there was already another company named Blue Sky Software, and sometimes they were associated with it. And well, Lerner Research didn't exactly speak to what they were doing anymore either, because they weren't really a research company. So initially, they had settled on using Flying Fish Designs, but that really didn't sound right to some of them. So they eventually settled on the title Looking Glass. They chose Looking Glass as a reference to the novel written by Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass. They felt that the novel and their company promoted the idea that their games transported people to new worlds. So, Looking Glass. But not Looking Glass Studios. While Looking Glass Studios was a good name, they still felt that their specialty was technology, so they decided to incorporate together as Looking Glass Technologies. So Looking Glass Technologies was founded on June 29th, 1992. Neurath was the president, Ned Lerner was the vice president, and their first game that they published was indeed Madden Football 1993, which of course was an absolute success. It's Madden, it's an early Madden. That Madden is such a success that it has been included in, I think, no less than 4 or 5 Maddens as a bonus add on in the future. So, very popular version of Madden. And while they were developing Madden for Electronic Arts, they were simultaneously developing the next title in the Ultima Underground series, which was Ultima Underground: The Stygian Abyss. So the Abyss was followed up with Ultima Underground 2, Labyrinth of Worlds. And while they were in the final stages of Ultima Underground 2, one of the designers and programmers in the studio and on that game, Doug Church, he went to Origin headquarters in Texas because he wanted to discuss with Origin what the next project for Looking Glass would be, and he wanted them to help fund it. At that point, according to interviews with Doug Church, the Looking Glass team had felt that they made too many dungeon games, and they were burnt out on dungeon games and frankly game development in general because the development schedule of Ultima Underground 2 was rushed by Origin. Because of this, the team knew that they wanted to stick to their specialty, which was immersive simulations, but they wanted to do it in a setting that was about as far from a fantasy setting, underground, as they possibly could. At first, they considered making one set in the current day, but they felt that that was going to beg too many questions. You know, why can't I pick up the phone? Why can't I hop on the web? Why can't I get on the train? There were just too many things that people could relate to that was going to break their idea of an immersive simulation. So, with that being said, they continued to throw out ideas to the team at Origin, and nothing stuck. So, Church returned back to Looking Glass Studios, which by that time had moved to Massachusetts, um, Cambridge, I think, which is 10 minutes outside of Boston, 10 miles outside of Boston. Lexington. They moved to Lexington. They moved to Cambridge later. They moved to Lexington, which is just outside of Boston. There, he, Narath, and another designer named Austin Grossman began to brainstorm alternate settings for a new game. And all of the things that they settled on were science fiction settings instead. Literally as far away from fantasy as you could possibly get, you know? At one point early on, they had coined the project Alien Commander because they strongly considered making it a spin off of one of Origin's most popular series, which was the Wing Commander series. But again, as they drilled the idea down, they felt too constrained by the limitations imposed on them by being attached to another franchise. So they ended up dropping that idea altogether. Then to kind of reboot what they were looking for and put their ideas together, the team got together and wrote what they later called minutes of gameplay. In a later interview, Doug Church gave an example. He said, "You hear the sound of a security camera swiveling, and then the beep of it acquiring you as a target. So you duck behind the crate, and then you hear the door open, so you throw a grenade and run out of the way." Now, in that example, you see security cameras that can acquire you. You learn that you have the ability to duck behind a crate. You have enemies that can open a door. You can throw grenades and you can run. These are all gameplay mechanics. So, by writing these minutes out, they were basically writing out gameplay mechanics that they liked. And from that, they slowly began to define the gameplay systems that they envisioned would make up their entire game. Now, I don't know if we've ever really seen anyone do it like that yet, have we, Rob?
I Not that I can think of. No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm sure other development studios have done it, but it's kind of interesting to see it like spelled out like that. It's kind of fascinating. The team considered this project an extension of some of the things that they learned while designing a specific section of Ultima Underground 2. And this section was called the Tomb Dimension. And one of the things that they sought to bring from that section was a focus on exploration. And they wanted to reduce the use of dialogue trees. They firmly believed that dialogue trees broke the fiction of games. Church later commented that the dialogue trees in Ultima Underground series were like separate games in themselves, and they were disconnected from the main experience of being immersed in the environment. So, in order to eliminate dialogue trees, the team prevented the player from ever meeting a living NPC. Instead, the plot of their project, they decided, was going to be conveyed through emails and log messages, all of which that were recorded and you know written down by dead NPCs.
No.
We've
So
seen
you
that
could talk to the
before.
dead.
We've seen that before, huh?
To the dead?
Well,
Like the
I
dead?
mean, no, but there are games in which the plot is told through things that you explore in terminals, right? Like recordings you find around, emails you find around, logs you find around. That is a very common gameplay mechanic these days, I would argue.
Yeah, no, it definitely is a lot more common.
It was revolutionary when they decided to do it. You understand, we are in the mid 90s. This So you have a game that's trying to be a first person story based game that's released essentially months after Doom is released. And Doom is not a story based shooter, right?
Right?
Doom is fast, frantic, run and gun. That's what Doom is. So these guys were trailblazers, so to speak, which we're going to drill down as we go along. But their idea of email logs and messages was they wanted to, Church said, plunge players into the fiction and never provide an opportunity to break that fiction. So they really tried to erase the distinction between plot and exploration. And they considered this to be just a natural progression from Ultima Underworld. They later said of this project, on some level, it's still just a dungeon simulator. We're really just trying to evolve that idea. Now, this idea of full immersion and so on and so forth led to the creation of one of the most recognizable villains of all time. The villain of this game makes it on almost every list of best video game villains of all time, and that would be the evil artificial intelligence Shodan. Shodan was designed to directly affect the player's gameplay. She sets traps, she interacts with the player through the environment, and she just acts as a brooding presence, nagging you in your ear as the player progresses through the game. She is a constant, reoccurring, consistent presence, an enemy that the team put into place to connect the player with the story meaningfully, right? So as the team continued to develop this project, which would later be known as System Shock, other things were happening. Their studio, Looking Glass, was also working on a flight simulator called Flight Unlimited. The physics simulator that they wrote for Flight Sim was modified slightly and put into use as a physics system for System Shock. So again, you have first person shooters like Doom and Quake and Duke Nukem, which are kind of in this time period. Well, Wolfenstein 3D just before that, that are really arcade like shooters. Whereas System Shock is using an actual physics system that they put into place. And that is way more sophisticated than any of the other first person shooters at the time. The studio was unfortunately focused on Flight Unlimited. Warren Spector had said that his biggest challenge as producer on System Shock was keeping the project afloat. He later said, "You don't want to know how many times the game came this close to being killed." And this was largely because Looking Glass was self publishing Flight Unlimited. So they had all their resources and money tied up into it. It had to be a hit. The money wasn't coming from anywhere else, right?
Right.
But they didn't want to hinge their bets on System Shock being the same way. So Spectre reached out and was able to organize or arrange a licensing deal with Electronic Arts for System Shock. Electronic Arts got the trademark to the game, while Looking Glass retained the copyright, which is a weird agreement. And he later said that they worked out this arrangement mostly to ensure that neither party could continue the franchise without the other's involvement, which is really clever if you look at it that way. So originally, System Shock was released in September of 1993 as a floppy disk release. System Shock, aside from being a fantastic game that is so influential, is also best known for its villain, who laid the groundwork for so many villains and narrators that just hang over your gameplay. And Shodan definitely had a voice. But unfortunately, that voice wasn't heard until December of 1994 when the studio released an enhanced CD-ROM version because there wasn't enough space for any of the audio, the vocals that they recorded on the floppy disks. Now, this was regretted by the team. They later said that they tried to keep them from releasing a floppy disk version, but that the decision makers in the studio were having none of it. And in hindsight, it is their belief, and others now, that having people experience System Shock as a quote unquote silent movie probably hurt its sales in the long run because it is so much better as the CD-ROM version with the not only is the narrator recorded, but many of the logs and everything are voiced over too. It's just so much more of an enjoyable game. Despite this, the game did sell around 170,000 copies, so it's not like it didn't sell any copies whatsoever. But that is nowhere close to games like Doom, for instance. Doom had released in December of 93, right? So a year sooner, And Doom had sold an estimated, I don't know, millions of copies roughly. I think it was um, millions of copies. Let's see. Let me look it up real quick. By May of 1994, they had distributed the S shareware version over 1 million times, and they sold around 200,000 copies in its first year, but eventually went on to sell 3.5 million copies. So it sold, but it wasn't anywhere on the level with its competition, right?
Right.
Um, and when Doom inspired a bevy of clones like Heretic, or later on Duke Nukem, Quake, which we've done episodes on, they were able to capitalize on the success of Doom, but truth be told, System Shock never really took off. And in all honesty, because of it, it really caused Looking Glass to lose money. Rob, do you know what doesn't cause you to lose money if you're good at it?
What's that, Dave?
Podcasting. You know, everybody's doing it these days. Have you, our fellow listeners, ever considered making your own podcast? Do you have something clever and engrossing that you'd like to share with the world, but you don't know how? Well, if so, our friends at Zencaster have created an all in one podcasting suite of tools that makes it easier than ever to create your own podcast.
With Zencaster, it's super easy to record a podcast. Everyone logs in using their web browser, and you just start recording a high quality podcast right away. It allows you to record up to 4K video with your guests, and with Zencaster's multi-layered backups, you always have the highest quality recordings, even if your connection is unstable.
And with Zencaster, you never have to worry about what you sound like. Zencaster's post-production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes all those ums and ahs, removes all those awkward pauses. You can set the right podcast loudness, reduce background noise. It's just a bunch of selections on a menu. You hit a click of a button, it does its work and emails you when it's finished to come download it.
And even if the thought of podcasting overwhelms you because you think you need a bunch of different tools and services, relax. With Zencaster's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create, edit, and distribute your podcast all from one place.
So, if you'd like to start your own podcast, or maybe you want to take your current podcast to the next level, we've got a deal for you. Go to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan.
Sign up for Zencaster today, and you can experience the same ease in producing your own high-quality podcast as we do each week. Go out and share your ideas with the world.
Well, Looking Glass is wrapping up System Shock and Flight Unlimited. They are looking for investors because they're perceiving that everything is going well and they want to grow. So in November of 1994, they managed to receive capital venture funding to the tune of about $3.8 million. And they used that money to move to a new office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Flight Unlimited became successful and spawned a series of sequels that help bring money in. In 1996, the company releases a game called Terra Nova Strike First Centauri. Now, Terra Nova was a tactical first-person shooter game set in a science fiction setting. The team wanted to return back to the good old days, their glory days at Origin, and they looked to the Wing Commander series for inspiration. Wing Commander was what they focused on, a bunch of missions bookended by simple cutscenes. But we're now in the mid 90s, and as we've learned in other episodes, CD-ROM and full motion video are becoming increasingly popular. So Looking Glass doesn't want to be left behind. So they decide to use the same format and bookend Terra Nova's missions with full motion video cutscenes. Now, for this studio, with them being unfamiliar with it, was an incredibly expensive endeavor. Endeavor? Endeavor. It was an incredibly expensive endeavor. It was an incredibly expensive endeavor. And frankly, it was one that the sales of Terra Nova never compensated them for. So after the release of Terra Nova, and there was another golf game they were working on that didn't sell well, Looking Glass found itself in financial trouble afterwards. So once again, the company was out there looking for investments, trying to keep the company afloat. And they found a partner in a company called Intermetrics in 1997 who bought the studio out. Now, Intermetrics was a software company. They were not a gaming studio. They specialized in compiler technology. Historically, they're best known for writing the software for NASA's Apollo program. But here they bought out Looking Glass Studios. They were looking to divest into other fields, so to speak. And collectively, the two companies were known as Intermetrics Entertainment Software LLC, but still operated underneath the trade name Looking Glass Studios. And as this buyout happened, a number of notable people left the studio. Co-founder Ned Lerner left to form a company called Multitude, and there were three guys that were working on a Star Trek Voyager game that was canceled in this purchase. They famously left to form a company called Irrational Games. And these three were designer Ken Levine, artist Rob Fermier, and programmer Jonathan Che. Right off the bat, Looking Glass actually approached Irrational. They wanted to co-develop a game. So they weren't part of the studio anymore, but they still wanted to work with the guys. And this team that wanted to work on this new project, they consisted of fans of the original System Shock. They were all people who wanted to make their own mark on that genre, so to speak. So they sat down and wrote a game pitch. The original pitch was a game called Junction Point. It was a story that was inspired by the novella Heart of Darkness. And in Junction Point, the player was tasked with assassinating an insane commander on his own starship. Now, the design philosophy was identical to that of System Shock. They wanted to develop a dungeon crawler, but in a science fiction setting. But they felt that System Shock was compared too closely to Doom, and that contributed to its lackluster sales. So, in order to distinguish themselves from it, they made what they considered to be some fundamental changes. For starters, they incorporated role playing elements, and they decided to make the environment persistent to add another level of immersion, right? So things changed, or things that you changed stayed. So if you ever left somewhere and came back, it'd be the way you left it. There was no resetting of areas or anything like that. It was a real living, breathing world that you could modify. But most importantly to the team, they decided that horror as a genre was going to be the key focus, and their as a genre, it was going to anchor upon four different points. One, isolation was going to be incredibly important. So the player was to have little to no contact with others. Two, a vulnerability was created by focusing the story on a fragile character. Three, they were going to create a mood by setting up intelligent placement of lighting and shadows. And lastly, they were going to add to that mood by including what they called moody sound effects, which, if you ask my wife, is me every day.
Nice one.
Mm-hmm. I figured I'd play it safe and put that on me.
Yeah, probably safe that way.
Yeah, probably safe that way indeed. And they got to work on what was going to be Irrational Games' first project, co-developed with what was left of Looking Glass Studios. But development is expensive, as we know, and as time stretched on, they had to find a way to pay the bills. So they began to shop the project out to publishers that could help fund the completion of the game. And for a while, they had no luck until Electronic Arts stepped up. And Electronic Arts said, sure, we're going to fund your game as long as you retool it as a sequel to System Shock. So they agreed, and that's exactly what they did. They incorporated the story of System Shock into their new game. It was Ken Levine who was tasked with bringing SHODAN back into the mix, but this time they kind of mix it up by allying her with the player, Won't give it completely away. And then the team just kind of expanded on the whole concept. The role playing mechanic evolved into a character customization system where there were different gameplay styles and multiple character paths. So their design kind of took what System Shock had started and turned it into a much more open ended gaming experience because of that, because now there were multiple ways to do things. Also, like it had more role playing and it was scary, more scary this time around. So it did, there were reasons why it was distinguished from the first one. But the process wasn't without issues. Because there were two companies involved, it said that at times there was a lot of tension around who was assigned to what. And as a result, there were notable developers that left the project while it was still being worked on. In the middle of that, the Columbine shooting happened. So then the future of the game was up in the air. In fact, um, at the E3 demonstration after Columbine, they were actually asked to remove guns from their demo of the game because guns were a very touchy subject after the Columbine shooting. So they weren't sure what was going to happen after that. But eventually everything calmed down, and despite all the hiccups, the team managed to complete their project, and System Shock 2 was released to the world on August 11th, 1999. I want to take a few moments here and kind of talk about how important this story as a whole is to the gaming industry. Because Looking Glass Studios is, despite not having the name recognition of the Electronic Arts and the Activisions and the Nintendos and so on and so forth of the world, Looking Glass is easily one of the most influential gaming studios to have ever existed. Easily. Ultima Underworld specifically influenced so many games. John Carmack himself cited its texture mapping technology as the inspiration to create something similar in his game Catacomb 3D. And it was Catacomb 3D that led to the creation of Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. So we have that to thank. Underground, we talked about in a recent episode, was also cited as the influence for Elder Scrolls as a series. Elder Scrolls Arena took design inspiration from Ultima Underground. Looking Glass also created the Thief series, which is a title we're going to be covering later this year. And Thief influenced games like Deus Ex, which we covered in another episode, and the Dishonored series. And System Shock here, along with those games, pretty much laid the groundwork for most of the immersive simulator genre. I mean, there are Half-Life designers that cite System Shock. There are people who work for EA, for Valve, like everywhere. Admittedly, a few years after Intermetric bought Looking Glass, they sold them off again. They actually divested their money that they had put into it elsewhere. And because there was no more money, Looking Glass actually folded in the year 2000. But the people they put into the work, like Irrational Games here, they all went on to do some great things. In fact, we've talked about Irrational Games before because Ken Levine and the team at Irrational Games is best known for creating the BioShock series, and we did a whole episode on BioShock. And BioShock is literally the spiritual successor of System Shock. They have outright said that they couldn't because, and we'll talk about that in a second, they couldn't keep making games in the System Shock series because of licensing issues. So they went on and took everything that they learned and wanted to do and wrote it into a completely new environment, and it became BioShock. I mean, it's not a far cry to understand that System Shock becomes BioShock, right? Ned Lerner himself eventually went to work for Sony itself. He worked on a variety of PS3 and PS4 games. There are members of Looking Glass that went on to work for DreamWorks, Valve, Ion Storm, EA. The music and the audio of System Shock, I didn't go into this specifically, but they were members of a local Boston band called Tribe. Tribe went on to, two of the members of the band specifically went on to join Harmonix and are notable people that helped develop the Guitar Hero and Rock Band series. And there are just countless other games and game designers that in some way, shape, or form cite the System Shock series It's integration of role playing elements, it's horror elements in first person shooters, it's physics engine. Like, there are just so many things that people said, I played System Shock and I knew what the future of this genre was. Now, when Looking Glass went under, its intellectual property of its catalog was bought out by the Meadowbrook Insurance Group, of all things. I don't, yeah,
Uh,
isn't that weird?
a little bit.
And because this is such an important game, there were attempts, mostly from the community at this point, to update the game to be played on modern systems. And they were able to patch it for a long while. But as the game got older, that became more and more difficult. And then a guy named Stephen Kick came around. And Stephen Kick went, he was a character artist for Sony. He worked on games like PlanetSide 2. And at one point, he went on a 9-month long trip through Mexico and Central America. And to pass the time, he brought a netbook and a bunch of classic games installed on it that it can run. And those games included System Shock 2. And in playing it again, he fell in love with the game and he decided that he wanted to revitalize it because it was getting to the point where, again, it was getting difficult to run on modern hardware. So it took him years pitching it to various companies, trying to, like, get crowdfunding type deal, like, which he didn't, but he looked into it. He proposed a modernization of it on Good Old Games, and it had people wishlist it so he could point to people he wanted to work with and say, look at how much interest people have in this. So he tried a bunch of things, and in 2012 he managed to get Meadowbrook to agree to sell him the licensing rights to the System Shock series. By then, a company they were associated with it had also gotten the copyright and trademark, so it was kind of all in one place. So he was able to acquire all the rights to it. And he founded a studio called Night Dive Studios to work on it. Now, Night Dive Studios has a reputation now. They are very well known for obtaining the rights to what we call abandonware games, updating their compatibility for modern platforms, aka Good Old Games, and re-releasing the titles. And he managed to do so first with System Shock. So they completely remade System Shock, the original System Shock, and they released it as a title remade for modern systems in 2023. And in doing so, they also announced that there would soon be an enhanced version of System Shock 2 not far behind it. There's no ETA on that at the moment. So if you're looking to do so, there is a modern there are modern remakes of System Shock and soon to be System Shock 2. This little piece of history that most people probably don't know, to be honest with you, is being preserved. And honestly, it's relatively easy to find a way to be able to play it. So, yeah, go play it. System Shock is incredibly important. And in it, you'll find the history of probably a lot of your favorite games if you're into story based shooters. And now you know.
Now you know.
Now you know. And like I said, there are so very, very many other things that are tied to this: Elder Scrolls and Deus Ex and BioShock, just a ton of other, series like Ultima and things like that. And we've done episodes on them. So we are just retouching on a place in history that we have revisited time and time again. A very pivotal part of history here. This is the culmination of a lot of those things coming together. So I would encourage you to go back and kind of learn the other stories to kind of see how all the little bits and pieces come together into this one. And of course, if you're looking to check out our old episodes, you can do so by going to our website, which is www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episodes. You can find a link to our Discord where you can maybe share little tidbits about how you felt about some of our episodes, or maybe your own little insight into some of the things that we may have missed during our recordings. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited episodes of our podcast. And you can also find a link to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David_is_wrong. Each week, We'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. About a game, a technology, a person, a place, a company, just something that I've determined to be relevant to the current week of gaming history, the publication date of this podcast. And one of the best parts about doing that is each week when I sit down to write a new story, I learn things. I don't know everything about everything, and it's so much fun to sit down and learn new things about so many recognizable titles from the annals of video game history. And it is even more so exciting to get to sit down week after week and share all the stuff that I learn with you guys. So, in celebration of that cycle of learning and teaching, we like to talk about our takeaways each week, and I would encourage you to do so with your friends. Encourage them to listen to our podcast and have conversations about it, man. That's the fun of all this. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think my favorite takeaway is that they went from creating Looking Glass speaking, went from John Madden's to System Shock. It's,
Yeah.
it's a very, very drastic shift in what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um,
But the only reason why that happened is because Lerner had been working with them on car simulation titles like Car and Driver. And part of the team in Car and Driver would influence Need for Speed too. So that, I mean, we've actually talked about Car and Driver before in our Need for Speed episode early on. But that successful relationship that they had with Car and Driver basically said EA was like, hey, we want you to, bring Madden to the Sega Genesis, which is kind of when Madden blew up, to be honest with you. 93 and 94, that's when those games like NHL and Madden like really blew up and became mass market items for sure. So that's just being in the right place at the right time, truthfully.
I mean, it's just funny to me, and you,
It
you make a
is.
good point about the car simulators too. I mean, it's just a very drastic shift from what they got started. And I mean, I'm sure other companies do it, and we've probably talked about other ones that do it. But it's just always so funny to see, like, hey, we didn't really like this genre, so we shifted to this other one and really found our niche.
Yeah. Well, they really never gave up simulations. They just went from car simulations to football simulations to flight simulators,
Yeah,
because,
just kind of shifting your method of simulation or
right.
travel in some instances.
Yeah, because Flight Unlimited got three. I believe there's three titles in that series. They made a few sequels to it and some DLC, which weren't called DLC at the time. They were called add-ons. But so they did keep doing simulations. But all in all, they just made a series of poor titles that didn't sell for whatever reason that brought the studio down, and everyone just went off and was successful elsewhere. That's what kind of happens, when you have good designers and poor management, because that's inevitably how this kind of stuff happens. Studios close, and good developers stay good developers, and they go elsewhere to be good developers. But bad companies are no more. Plain and simple. So
Yeah, well, that's it for me, Dave. And you?
I this one's tough because I knew a lot of it because we've touched on it so much. I never dove this deep into the history of System Shock, so that was really fascinating. I mean, I know I definitely did when we did the BioShock episode to learn it, but I got to dive into it more and learn more about like the design documents and the original pitch and how things kind of changed as they went into it. And that kind of stuff always fascinates me. I like diving into the nitty gritty stuff, some of which I don't get to talk about because we only have an hour and I try to be respectful of people's time. So, but this is a fascinating story, and it makes me sad to think of how many people have never played a System Shock title, because if you ever have an opportunity to do so, you will recognize it so intimately if you're into modern story-based shooters. Like Shodan is the impetus for oh God, what's her name? The Portal AI. Oh good lord. Gladys. I mean, she's the inspiration for Gladys, and she's the inspiration for the narrator in Bioshock, and there are countless other titles where you have the narrator and playing with you and messing with you and so on and so forth. And this all started here. Like the whole concept of a first person shooter that wasn't just arcade based started here. You would find so much familiarity in this title. I highly encourage you, if you've never played it, to go back and play System Shock and soon System Shock 2 if you're a fan of this genre. Highly, highly encourage you. You will not be disappointed. They are System Shock 2 way more than System Shock 1, but they're good stories, very much. And System Shock 2, I would venture, is an excellent story. So go play it.
Go play it indeed.
All right, Rob. Well, before I bring it into next week, is there anything else that you'd like to add to today's episode?
As always, I want to take one quick moment to say thank you so much to all of our listeners. It means the world to us as you join us along in our learning endeavors, and we appreciate it.
Awesome.
So thank you.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the creation of System Shock 2 and the fascinating history of both Looking Glass and Irrational Games. I really hope that you've enjoyed this airy, thought-provoking trip down memory card lane. Maybe learn something new about how a small studio, because they were not a big AAA studio, kind of pushed the boundaries of video games in their entirety. Like, in their entirety. Next week, though, we're leaving behind the dark corridors of System Shock 2, diving into a world full of stylus action and demonic battles. We're going to visit one of Rob's favorite series of all time. Get ready to unleash your inner devil hunter, Rob, because we're going to explore the iconic Devil May Cry series. We'll dive into its history, its stylish combat. We'll talk about your favorite character, Dante. That is your favorite character, isn't it?
Maybe.
Okay. And and we'll have a discussion about how Devil May Cry really revitalized the hack and slash genre. So, if you thought System Shock 2 was groundbreaking, wait until you hear about the game that turned action into an art form. Join us next week as we slash and shoot our way through the legacy of Devil May Cry on yet another trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Dooba-dup-dup-dabba-dup-dabba-doo-wah.